This applies whether we're talking of a church or a synagogue, or a mosque or a temple, whether it's a grand cathedral or a tin tabernacle. After all, some of our churches aren't even churches. But despite their differing faiths and sizes and constructions and previous occupations, what links all these buildings is their importance, both to the communities who use them and to the heritage of the nation as a whole. Places of worship are the most numerous, most accessible, and the most visited of all historic buildings. Obviously, these buildings deserve to be kept in good condition, but far too often they get sick. And what sick buildings always used to get was a big red thermometer, slowly counting the pennies as the garden fete followed the jumble sale in a race to beat the rot. The thermometers may be on the way out, but the race is ever present. Because while you wait for the money to come in, the problem gets worse and the target recedes. Damage may be occurring to irreplaceable historic features. What's lost can often never be fully recovered. The solution to this problem is to not have the problem. For historic buildings, prevention is definitely better than cure. Planned maintenance is the key. Most major building failures are caused by one small problem, a broken slate or a blocked gutter, that over time eats away at the building until someone notices, which usually means it's too late. Spotting these small problems might help to avoid the major failures. A planned regime of systematic inspection and maintenance is simple, cheap, rewarding, and most importantly, keeps the building intact. Regularly inspecting every inch of a building this size, however, can seem a daunting prospect. Where do you start? What are you looking for? How do you fix it when you find it? But by breaking a task down into bite-sized chunks and scheduling it sensibly, almost anything can be achieved. You just need a little faith in maintenance.
My name is Sarah Crofts, and I'm the Project Director of Faith and Maintenance. Faith and Maintenance was set up by the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings to help volunteers understand how their buildings work and how to look after them. The project has the full support of the major denominations in the UK, such as the Church of England and the Methodist Church. At its simplest, maintenance is just a way of slowing down the rate of decay by keeping the fabric of a building in good condition. When William Morris set up the SPAB in 1877, he enshrined this very idea in his manifesto, when he urged us to stave off decay by daily care. As you'll see, maintenance encompasses two main activities: looking and doing. Looking involves inspecting the building to assess its condition and noting any areas of concern. Learning how to spot problems and then knowing who to turn to for advice about repairs is vital. However, there are some practical tasks, the doing element, which can be carried out by volunteers, such as clearing drains and gutters and checking that pipework is free from leaks. It's important to understand that maintenance is different from repair, which is work carried out to put right defects or damage. Works of repair will usually need to be specified by your architect or building surveyor and will often require permission from your denominational body. We hope that this programme will help you to spot potential problems and understand what you can do on a daily basis to stave off decay in your place of worship. However, before carrying out any work, you must think about safety. Consider carrying out a risk assessment, which is simply an examination of the situations that could cause harm to people. Have you taken enough precautions to reduce the risk of an accident? No one should take on any task that they don't feel competent or physically able to perform. If you're in any doubt, use a reputable professional contractor. Try not to work alone, but if you must, ensure that someone else is aware of what you're doing and where you'll be. You should also think about using protective equipment, such as stout shoes, safety goggles and thick gloves, especially where there might be harmful substances such as bird droppings. Be especially careful when working at height or in confined spaces. Be wary of fragile surfaces that may not take your weight, such as roof lights or delicate plaster and timber ceilings. Lastly, expect the unexpected, for example, hypodermic needles or broken glass in gullies. This DVD is only part of the package of resources that Faith in Maintenance offers. We've also produced a maintenance handbook, a Good Maintenance Guide, and a calendar to help you understand what to do and when. A copy of the handbook and calendar are given freely to all the volunteers who take part in our training days. Details of the training days can be found on the project website, spabfim.org.uk, which also contains further information and guidance. Finally, it is important to remember that the maintenance of a building depends very much on the different techniques and materials used in its construction. To this end, we're going to visit a number of churches of varying ages throughout this programme, so that whatever the place of worship you're involved in looking after, we believe you'll find it useful, informative and inspiring, and that hopefully together we can protect this nation's heritage for future generations.
Accompanying us on this tour is volunteer Daphne Fulsham of Albury in Surrey, who will be guided by maintenance expert David Lodge. David is not just the chairman of the Faith in Maintenance Steering Group, but is also a retired builder with 36 years of experience in repairing churches. Having worked on over 600 of these buildings, he was constantly amazed by how much of the work could have been avoided by an eagle eye and a timely intervention.
This is the earliest church we're going to visit. This is predominantly Norman.
It's beautiful.
The nave and the chancel. The tower is slightly later, probably only 100, 200 years later, and the little porch later than that. And it's all of local material.
Yes.
Flints that have been brought and stones, field
Which
stones.
makes it so individual and interesting.
All in lime mortar, and some tiles that have been robbed from a Roman villa, and soft red bricks. And also we have the clay tiles on the roof because this is a predominantly clay tile area.
Right.
It has no damp course in a building of this age, and that has presented its problems.
I'm sure.
So perhaps we'll go and have a look at that and I'll tell you more about it.
Lovely.
Now in 1984 this church had the plaster falling off the wall inside due to dampness. As we've said, there's no damp course in these buildings and there's no practical way to put a damp course. Therefore you have to manage the damp. It's just rising damp mainly, and you've got to manage it. Now the first problem is that the ground here was higher than the floor inside, and it's so important to try and get the ground lower than the floor. Just like a modern building, you wouldn't have the damp course and then have ground on the outside higher than the damp course. And so if I can just step down here, I'll show you what was here. Originally there was a brick gully here all the way round with a slate damp course up the wall, and the water then ran round it. But the thing is that it's stopping the moisture coming out of the wall, and so it couldn't breathe. So it's taken away, take that away, lower the ground, and then the wall can breathe.
David, is there any value in a shingle-filled trench round a church like this?
Well, there is some value, but just not as good as getting the ground lowered below so that it can breathe, because the shingle tends to clog up, and also the moisture is still there against the wall. So if we can go inside and have a look, then we'll see what the result is. And inside now, the plaster, the lime plaster which was put on, seems to have been quite successful. And over that we have lime wash, which is allowing the wall to breathe.
Looks good. David, at our church we've got blistering right along the base of the wall. What would cause that?
Well, obviously I can't tell without seeing it, but it seems to me that possibly you have some modern paint on there which won't breathe, so that might be blistering off. Or it might be hard render, which is what they'd actually tried to do here. They put this hard render on thinking it was going to keep the dampness out, and it didn't, so it just pushed it off the wall. And just along here, this is just a little bit of dampness still creeping out, but it will take a long while for these thick walls to dry out. Also, of course, it's important about the floor, because if you've got damp wall and it touches a wooden floor, then it starts to rot the floor at the edges.
Of course, yes.
So you need to keep the floor, and also these timber floors need to be well ventilated, otherwise they set up rot very quickly.
So do you mean they have air bricks outside that let the...
Generally not. The air ventilation is usually in the aisle, in the end of the timbers at the aisle. If you can imagine, these are such thick walls that you couldn't get ventilation from outside. And also, historically, when the church was built, it didn't have any floors. You walked in and it was dirt on the floor. Now then, gutters and rainwater pipes. The most important facet on the building, in my opinion. They need to be maintained and kept in good order. All these here are cast iron, and if you look after them, they'll last you forever.
And how often should we have a maintenance check on them? And when? When do we clear them?
Right, well that's a good question. Generally we say at the end of November when you've had leaf foliage, once a year. But in certain circumstances, if you've got a lot of pigeons on your building, or if you've got trees, lots of trees that are very close and they're going to drop more leaves, then twice a year probably, in April as well. And we have National Maintenance Week in November, which the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings runs, and that's particularly to encourage people to clean their gutters and rainwater pipes.
And how do we find out about it? Website?
Yes, go onto the SPAB website and you will find all the details on there.
Marvellous.
And also, they need to be kept painted, you see, otherwise they rust.
Yes.
And once the rust sets in, then you've lost them.
And how often should we be doing that?
I've recommended about every 3 to 5 years. You see, this rainwater pipe is already rusting and needs decoration. And probably if I run my hand down the back here, you see it's very rusty at the back.
I do.
So it's so important that this is decorated shortly. Then the second most important thing is when the water arrives at ground level, that it gets away from the building.
So where's that water going?
That's going into a soakaway. You see, here you won't have mains drains in a little country parish like this, and so you dig a trench and put a pipe in, and then a big hole, and you fill it with stones, and then on a wet day it can fill up the hole, and on a dry day it dries away again. But the most important thing is to keep this gully clean so that the water can get down.
I can see we've got a sapling there.
Well, yes, that's not going to help, is it? And within a year that'll be grown up to here, and it would be so easy for a volunteer just to pull it out.
Yeah.
Another thing that volunteers should look for is growth up against buildings. You see, this tree is growing quite rapidly now, and it's going up into the gutter. And other churches will have trees very close to them, and they need proper maintenance.
Well, this can be thinned and pruned back, so I think it's rather nice to have.
Yes, I'm not saying that one's got to completely do away with it, but you can see at the moment it's already causing problems, and it will hold dampness on the wall.
Yes.
So any growth against the wall anywhere is not good for the building.
Yes.
And you know, if it's a large tree, it's going to suck all the moisture out of the ground and cause problems with foundations.
So, David, should we be worried about something like this fracture?
No, you shouldn't be worried about it. But what can be done is photographs could be taken and records so that you can see whether it gets worse or not. Because you will often find cracks in large buildings like this. They have very little foundation and they move. There are other alternatives. You can put a telltale on there, which is 2 little strips of plastic, and they fit on the wall and have little marks on them, and they can be read, and you can see whether the crack is getting wider or narrower. Or one of the simple things I always recommend is that you can point up the crack with some lime mortar, and if it appears again, you know it's moving, and then perhaps you report it to your professional, you know, that will then give you professional advice as to why it's moving and what to do. You see the metalwork in front of the glazing there? It actually holds the glazing, there's little clips around it. It's very important that that's kept decorated. We call it ferramenta. That's the professional name for it. What happens if you don't keep it painted? It rusts and corrodes and it expands, and then it blisters the stonework and the brickwork. Another thing to keep an eye out for. Just going to have a look through these binoculars and see how this roof is. And yes, it has quite a lot of problems. I think some of them you can probably see with your naked eye, but a binocular is a really useful thing. You can see there's some tiles missing, but if you look at the ridge, you can see it's lifted.
Oh, yes.
It's only going to take a wind and a storm, and that will blow them off.
That looks very expensive.
Well, the important thing
Big job.
is to put back in the tiles that have come out, so that the birds can't get in there, the weather can't get in there and cause more problems. Then yes, you've got to start fundraising, you've got to talk to your architect, and
Big job.
yes, it's a big job. But there are small jobs that you can do to keep it going. You can make a roof last for quite a few more years if you take care of it. But it is a profession, it's where you need to call the professionals in. Another thing you can use the binoculars for is inside the building when you're inspecting. You can have a look up and it gives you a good idea of whether there's any problems, particularly the white boarding. If you saw a stain on the boarding, you could record that stain perhaps with a camera, and then next time when you come round, if the stain has got larger, you'll know there's a problem there. Or you may see other stains that weren't there the first time round.
And am I looking for signs of woodworm, beetle, things like that?
I wouldn't worry greatly about that, particularly woodworm. In an oak roof like that, you're unlikely to get woodworm. But beetle you can look out for, but that's only in the spring, and you look out for those on the floor.
What, actual beetles?
Yes, they will drop out. They mate in the spring, and the poor old male, he gets thrown out and dies on the floor. So you can go round looking for them, and then you can report that to your architect again,
Yes,
so that he knows where the beetles have fallen.
So here we have chalk and flint.
We do, yes. The chalk we call clunch in the trade. It is just a hardened chalk, but that's a professional name for it. And these flints are called galleting. But as you were saying, it's a different material. And as we go round the different buildings, we're seeing lots of different materials. Brick, stone, and throughout the country there are numerous stones in various regions, and all sorts of other materials that have been dug out of the ground. And so each area needs specialist attention when it goes wrong. And so it's very important that the right professional tradesmen are employed, and also the architect or the engineer is the right professional for that area.
So what should the volunteer be looking for in walls?
You could take photographs. If you're good at sketches, you can sketch, or you can just record in notes about the wall when you see it deteriorating. If we have a bad winter, if there's hard frosts, you may notice that the wall has deteriorated in a certain place. A piece of stone has come away, perhaps some joints in the stone have disappeared, and joints are very important to be filled regularly rather than left for a long time so that the water can go in. And those sorts of issues. So it's a matter of recording and reporting when you think there is a problem that's wrong. So if we have a look round the corner here.
This looks worryingly fragile. Ooh.
Yes, it is. It will erode back a little further before it needs attention. What's happened here is some years ago, I imagine the bottom of the wall was decaying, and somebody thought it would be a good idea to put this solid brickwork here and this big solid plinth. And it's all in a hard mortar and hard bricks. And of course, what it's doing is pushing the moisture up the wall. It's a classic example of it. And so these stones here are getting very wet compared with the stones further up. And you will see some of the stones have actually already been replaced. And what it will be is at some point in time, when these have eroded a little further back, they'll have to replace some more of them. But this is where an inappropriate repair many years ago has created a dampness problem now. It's the same as using hard cement render. It's the same as hard pointing, vertical slate damp courses. All the different methods of trying to solve dampness at lower level pushes the dampness to higher level. Here we've got an example of lime plaster. Most medieval churches were plastered originally, and much of it has decayed away, and now it's not been replaced by other plaster, and so you see the stones or the flints. But here we've still got lime plaster, and it's good because it can breathe. The water can go into it, and it can breathe out of it again. If you put a modern plaster on, a hard cement render, it won't breathe. And then the water gets in, it gets trapped, and it can't come out again.
Yes.
And then here also, they have lime washed it. And it's a sacrificial thing. Lime wash is there, and it washes down every so often. It needs another coat just to keep it going.
Looks
It's
good.
just a natural
Looks
thing.
good.
Well, yes, it's not sort of pristine like a modern paint, but it serves its purpose.
What's the significance of stopping the plaster short here?
No, what's happened there is that there's been damp problems in the church, and the ground has been lowered, and the render was down to that level,
Right.
and now it looks as though
Yeah.
it was done the other way round. There's an example of moss on the roof, which is not really a good thing. It's best to get it removed because it holds the moisture, and then if you get a hard winter or a frost, it will break down the tiles. And so it can be killed and brushed off the roof with brushes. But again, it needs a contractor to do it. It's not really the sort of thing that a church warden should do. It's good to come up here on a rainy day at this church because it has these lovely lead overflows. And the idea is that if the rainwater pipe, the hopper head there, gets blocked, perhaps a pigeon nests in it or something, the water will start to come out of the overflow. So it's just a warning to you that that's happening. You don't want it to keep coming out of the overflow. So then you can climb up, or you can get an experienced person to climb up.
They really are very handsome, aren't they? They're an embellishment to the church.
Yes, I think they look
I
quite
think they're
nice.
lovely.
And they're very practical. Here we have a nice new gully, only been put in recent years, and it's got a nice cover on it to try and keep out rubbish. But we'll get a certain amount of rubbish. It'll probably come down the rainwater pipe. So it's the sort of thing a volunteer can do, is to lift the cover off and see what's below it. So we've already looked at the windows on the south side and the porch, both in hardwood, and you saw they weren't painted. And here we have a very good example of some oak doors that also haven't been painted. And a nice oak frame, which is probably the same date as the tower, which is about 1800. So you see, if you've got good hardwood, you don't need to paint it.
Should we be feeding it?
Well, I don't believe in feeding it. What our ancestors did, they actually lime washed it, and you can just see traces of the lime wash there. So if anything, that would be what to do, but I think you can leave them quite natural. They get moisture on them when it rains, and when you get the sunny day, they dry out. And it's just a natural thing. But if you paint them or feed them, then it's got to be done constantly. You can't just do it once and think that's it, because you're then going to hold the moisture in the door or the window or the porch, and it can't come out. Now here we have a tower built of what we call soft red bricks. But soft doesn't mean that they should decay away, but you'll see some of them are decaying away. I mean, they've lasted 200 years, but now they're decaying away. But that's not really a problem for the volunteer to deal with.
Yeah.
When your architect comes round at the quinquennial survey, he will pick it up and say perhaps it's time to replace some of them because they're getting too far back and causing problems.
Right. Now, should we be doing something about this ivy, David?
Oh yes, this is the worst thing that you can have. The important thing is to cut it off at its ground level where it's some of it's coming out of the wall there, and put a systemic weed killer on it so that it
Right.
goes back and kills the
Now,
root.
I see here we've got a young sapling growing actually in the mortar.
Yes. Well, that needs getting out. Again, if you can break it off and put some systemic weed
Yes.
killer in it first of all, because if you just pull it out, you're
Pull
likely to
everything
do
else,
more
yes,
damage. It's the
yes.
same as the ivy.
Yes.
But it's one of the worst things is to get ivy on the wall. It gets its tentacles all into the joints in the
Yes.
brickwork.
I can see they've killed one here. It's just the stump left. So
Yes, that was
Obviously
probably
that-
from a
yes,
previous
yeah.
time. Here is a good example of some ivy that has been cut at the root at an earlier date, and now we can see that it's dead and it will be easy to strip it off without causing damage to the fabric. In this church we've got a lath and plaster ceiling, quite an ancient one too, probably 400 years old, and that needs keeping an eye on from time to time, because it's very easy for the ribs on the back of the plaster to break away, and then perhaps a lump of plaster will fall. But usually there are signs before that happens. Classic sign is a crack, and up here we have one little crack, not serious at the moment, but every so often it would be good to look and see whether other cracks. And if further cracks appeared, then you would contact your architect, because it's needs a professional advice.
I imagine so, yes. David, this looks serious. What can we do about this?
Well, something actually has already been done. It's caused by dampness. The ground outside the church was higher, much higher than the floor inside the church. So about 20 years ago, the ground was lowered. It takes time to dry out. There is this theory that a wall takes about an inch a year to dry out. And as that wall is probably 36 inches thick, it's going to take a long time to dry out completely.
Yeah.
And also I've discovered that they didn't remove the algae at the time, and so that's been there for the last 20 years. I think shortly they're going to remove the algae and see whether it comes back, and that will then show whether the problem has been resolved. When the ground's been lowered, that's not the end of the story. It needs regular maintenance, and here we can see that the greenery, all the growth is starting to overtake again, and that won't help it dry out.
On the face of it, this looks wonderful. I'm sure you'll find me something there.
I will try my hardest.
Yeah, I bet.
Let's go and have a look. Here we have a brick drainage channel. I hate these things. You see, the problem is that the water comes down the rainwater pipe and enters the brick channel, and then it's got to travel all the way down to the gully, which is down that end. Well, of course, on the way, it comes over all these cracks because the gully isn't pointed, and so that's urgently needs pointing so that the water gets down. I mean, preferably, you take the gully away and you put a drainage gully under that rainwater pipe and take it to its own drain. And you see against the wall there it's cracked, so all the moisture will be getting down there. I bet that is really wet under there, and I think we'll see the signs of it when we go inside.
I can see there are some tiles here as well.
Well, that's another interesting telltale, isn't it? Let's stand back and have a look. And you see, yes, there's 2 tiles missing from the roof. It's as simple as that.
And what about this gutter here?
Oh, wow, yes, well spotted. Yes, plastic gutter, expansion and contraction, it's pulled apart. But rather urgent that it's put back together again,
so.
because that's going to drop there. It's probably why those plants are growing there. Good moisture from the gutter. Oh, and there's also growth coming out of that one up there. Growing right in the outlet. Here we have a rainwater pipe which actually does go into a gully, but it hasn't got a curb round it. That would be useful to stop the splashing when there's a big storm, because I can see by your feet there that it has been overflowing because it's brought the shingle to the surface and there's no grass there. But of course it may also be because the gully might be blocked. I have a pair of gloves, so we'll have a look, shall we? It's very important that you wear gloves, and preferably thick ones if you can, because quite often you can find sharp pieces of glass. I've even come across needles down here, so that is important. And what do we have here?
Yeah.
Lots of lovely mud.
Oh dear. Yeah.
It just keeps coming.
Yeah.
So all the water is going around the foundations and not into the drains. I think I'll leave it at that. So there's an air vent there.
Yes.
That's fairly clear, isn't it?
Yes.
But I wonder where the next one is. You see, it's almost
Oh,
buried.
yes. I see.
The putting in
Yes.
of these memorials here, the ground has risen up. You can see it rising past that buttress, and the air vent is nearly gone.
I can
It
see
is
it.
important because that is the underfloor flow of air to
Yeah.
the wooden
Easily
floors.
done.
Easily
Easily
done,
done.
yes, it's a simple thing. Here we have the copper lightning conductor going all the way to the top of the spire. Something a volunteer can do, I would say a couple of times a year, is to look at it and make sure that it's secure. That's the most important thing.
How often should it be tested?
At least every 5 years. Some people recommend 3 years, so between 3 and 5 years. I find the heating system in this church quite fascinating because below us here we have the old cast iron Victorian heating system, which is now unused. Here we have a pretty modern radiator, and over here, as you will see, we have a cast iron radiator from a period in between.
I used to love sitting on these. Still do.
Yes, I'm sure they're very nice to sit on. But the important issue with heating is that when it's finished with at the end of the season, it should preferably be drained down, and the boiler should be serviced by a competent engineer. And also, when it's filled up at the beginning of the winter, we need to check that the frost thermostat is working so that that protects it. And also, the volunteer can check to make sure whether any insulation or lagging has come adrift from pipes or tanks.
Lot to do.
Yes. Well, as I suspected, you can see by the blistering here that they have got a damp problem.
So with a bit of vigilance, this could have been avoided.
Exactly. Here we have some signs of early medieval wall painting on the plaster, which is quite interesting. There's lots of lovely monuments in this chancel.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful, aren't they? Then you've got the decorated ceiling, beautiful stained glass. And so you can see how important it is that dampness is kept out of a building.
Absolutely.
All of these will suffer if you have dampness. And ventilation is also a very important issue. You see, over here we have a little hopper, and that should be open, letting air flow through the building. So here we have a very different type of building to the ones we've been looking at. This was built about 1800. Still has the same elements, a wall and a roof, but here we've got brick and slate, and it certainly won't have a damp course at that period. There's a good place to start, I can see already. The growth. I'll just move this out of the way.
Oh, yes.
You see, that hasn't been growing for 3 minutes. So this hasn't been cleaned out for some time, has
I can
it?
see that.
This is going to get bigger
Yes.
and put roots in there, and we
Yes.
can see down the drain that the drain hasn't been cleaned out, so it's full of water.
Yeah, yeah.
So all the dampness is going back into the brickwork and going to creep up the
Yes,
brickwork because we
yes.
have no damp course. And also, that's a little bit loose and could do with a fixing in it because after a while...
Yes, I can
it's
see it's come out here, yes.
Yeah. So these are simple little jobs. I mean, this takes 2 minutes to pull that out. It's not a costly job, and that would not be either.
No.
These are the sort of things I look for. You see, there's dampness here. You've got moss, and you can see these bricks are wet. So I immediately look up above to see where it's coming from. And it could well be the end of the gutter there. But there's a rubber seal in the gutter, and maybe it's decayed and it's dripping down. And in the winter, if you get a very hard frost, it's going to break that brickwork up. But maybe we can have a look from above and see whether that is the problem.
Right.
First thing you've got to remember when you're on a flat roof is not to go too near the edge. It's so easy to slip, and we don't want people falling down. So I'm just going to kneel down here gently so that I can have a look and see this problem that we looked at before. And I can see straight away that it is not as I thought. The gutter is still in quite good order. But the lead here, which is probably difficult for you to see, is not quite turning the water into the gutter. So some of the water that's running down the roof is going off the lead and down the wall and dripping down there. It just needs a little piece of lead tucked under there to turn the water into the gutter. And that would solve the problem.
Very minor.
Very minor problem
Very minor.
again, but it will stop that green mould growing down on the base there. So we've seen quite a bit of peeling paint elsewhere, and here's another classic example. This is a modern paint which won't adhere to the oak sill. You see, it could be quite simply taken off by a volunteer, so at least the water that's coming down at the moment is not going to get held in there and start to rot the sill again. And it's not the ultimate answer, it needs really repainting with a linseed oil paint, and that
Right.
should solve the problem.
Right.
And I see behind you another little problem there. Look at this rainwater pipe. It's been broken off. And now all the water is just going down the wall, as you can see, and it's going green.
Okay.
It's only a simple little problem, really. It just needs cutting out and a shoe putting on there to direct the
A
water
shoe
away from the
being-
building. The shoe is a little piece that comes at the bottom of the rainwater pipe and
Right,
sends the
yes.
water out away from the building. Now here's another little problem that I've seen. I think you'll see that in the joints between the cappings on the top of the wall, there's no mortar, they're open, so all the rain is going to come down. That's what a capping is for, to stop the water getting into the wall. And you can even see the open joints in the brickwork where that wall is starting to get saturated. It's a very inexpensive job to put lime mortar.
Lime mortar.
Yes, it must be lime mortar. You don't want a hard mortar because it will damage the stonework. So
I see.
you could get a local builder to do it. It's not really a job for a volunteer. I think not, no. Now here's another example of where a little bit of paintwork could have solved the problem. The timber work there is all decaying because it hasn't been repainted. And now if a man gets up there, it won't be just a matter of a bit of paintwork because the timber is rotten, so it's going to have to be replaced. So you see, a simple job becomes a big problem.
David, I can see there's a lovely cupola, lead cupola there. I think we're all concerned about lead. It's such a vulnerable material now. If we need to replace lead, what can we replace it with?
I think it's very difficult to replace lead. It's the natural material for what it's doing. Look at the lovely curve
Yes.
and the way it's been dressed. You can't really dress metalwork like that.
No.
I think what you've got to do, I know people are very worried about it at the moment, but you've got to try and think about security measures. You see, they have lights there on those crosses, so hopefully if they put those lights on at night, at least the burglar is not going to climb up there and take the lead in the middle, you know, with all the floodlights on him. And there's lots of other ways of securing buildings so that the people can't get there. Gates on churchyards need to be locked. People walking their dogs and things like that, they should be asked to keep an eye on the church at night. Much more a security issue than replacing it with a material that won't last. That material will last 300 or
Beautiful.
400 years.
Yes.
Whereas some of our metals that we're using, even stainless steel, quite often isn't stainless, it corrodes. So at the front of the church here we have a flat roof, which is good to inspect. But you see the road slopes away and there's no way of fixing the ladder at the top. So it's not really a safe issue for volunteers. You need a builder. But if you think this is a problem to get at, there's far bigger problems.
I'm sure. David, this is awesome. A mighty task for any volunteer. Where do we start?
Well, I think probably in my favourite place, the roof. So let's go and have a look outside and see if we can get back far enough to see it. Now we're back from the building, we can immediately see that there's loads of little lead clips. You can see the sunlight shining on them. So there's many slates have already fallen out of that roof, and they've been diligent and they've replaced them. But this is where a volunteer can come on a regular basis, have another look at the roof, probably through binoculars, and they will be able to see whether any more slates have come out, because that roof is what we call in the trade nail sick, and at one point it's going to need replacing.
Oh.
But there is access to the roof, so a builder can get up there and replace the odd slate when they come out. And that's good management. There really is good access equipment available now, and although it may seem expensive initially, it's going to save many thousands of pounds in the long run. And whilst the builders are up there with the access equipment, it's good to get them to look over the rest of the roof and any other high-level items, and they can report if there's anything that needs urgent attention. What a wonderful synagogue.
Yes, it is. Jewel colours.
Yes, and so many different materials. You have brass over there, and we've got cast iron columns here, beautiful stained glass windows.
Beautiful.
Decoration on the ceiling, gold leaf, so many different facets. And many of them need cleaning, and they can be, if you're not careful, inappropriately cleaned. For instance, with the brass here, you can see where the cleaning material has gone into the decoration here. And if one over cleans this, you lose the wording and you can't read it. I've seen in churches where brasses on the floor have been so cleaned that you can't read the inscription anymore.
Yeah. Yes.
And it's the same with stained glass. If it's Victorian stained glass, it just needs brushing gently. That's all one should do, soft brush. And of course, if it's medieval stained glass, you really shouldn't clean it at all. You leave it up to the professional.
I think a lot of it is attention to detail. I was looking at the brass here with a lot of the polish left in. A sort of a soft brush and warm water would get that out, and it would just look so much.
A little toothbrush,
handsome
a little
after.
toothbrush would do the trick.
Yes.
The glazing here is sagging a little, but it's still quite firm. And that's the sort of thing a volunteer can just check when they see that, because if it starts to become loose, it needs to be reported to the professional. Probably because the lead here is starting to decay and the putty within the lead. And you can see some of that has spilt down here into the condensation channel.
I can see the little hole here has become blocked.
Yes, well the theory is that any condensation runs down along the channel, out through the little hole. So that's another job the volunteer can do, is to keep that clear. You'll get it the same in medieval churches, but you'll probably find that it's a lead condensation tray. You have massive signs of dampness here.
I can see it. It looks horribly expensive.
Yes, I'm afraid it is. And I think when we go outside, we're going to see rather a large number of slates missing from the roof.
We're so high up here. How will we view it?
Well, this is a good opportunity where we could go and ask the neighbours whether we could view it from their property.
Good thinking.
Let's go and have a look.
Goodness, David, we need a flymo for this.
Yes, well, I think it's a little more serious than that, Daphne. You see, look, one section, it's gone so badly that it's already fallen. And this section here is about to fall. If you can imagine that dropping on somebody's head, a real safety issue.
Yes.
Needs tackling very urgently.
Yes.
Well, it's kind of the owners to let us up here on their roof. And as we feared, we can see broken slates over there and slipped slates down here. And then there's the guttering. You can see some of it's fallen down, some of it's full of grass. It's looking a pretty sorry state for itself.
David, this building is by the coast, and I've also seen quite a few pigeons. So how can we protect the building against salt and acid? Because I can see there's quite a lot of erosion here on the stone and the gutters. Is there any way we can protect against these things?
Well, I think the erosion there on the stonework may well be poor quality stone was used and it's naturally eroded away. I don't think it's necessary that the salt in the air has caused that. But you notice particularly it's there where the water has been running down from the fascia. Probably the gutter just isn't working. So it's probably had quite a concentration of water on it. If there's any ledges, you can put down gels or you can put down little needles to stop pigeons sitting on your ledges.
But they can be a problem.
Because, well, they can be a terrible problem. They block the gutters and rainwater pipes up. But those are the sort of things you can do. But the stonework is much more a problem for your professional advisor, because each, as I said before, each stone is different.
Volunteers working on a historic building or a church may well feel that their architect or surveyor is a rather distant character who is going to cost them money every time they pick up the phone. But if your surveyor or architect is working with you, you may well find that they can give you good advice and may in the long term be able to save you money because they're pointing you in the right direction and helping you understand the best way to look after your building. The important thing is that the architect you employ is somebody who understands the history of your building, or rather understands historic buildings, unless your church is a 1960s church, in which case most architects will know what they're looking at. But with a Victorian church or pre-Victorian building, you need somebody who understands historic building structures, the way lime mortars work, the way stones are put together, why bricks were made the way they were, how lead works. All those sort of things come with experience. Different churches will have different relationships with their architect. It's worth pointing out that the Church of England has a system whereby you have a retained architect or inspecting architect who will come round every 5 years and do a report on the condition of the building, hopefully to pick up things that you may not be aware of yourselves. When we're working on old buildings, one of the beauties of working on them is seeing the craftsmanship that's gone into them in the past. People have spent vast amounts of time and money building them well, and it's equally important that when we come to repair those buildings, that we do so to the same level of care. Not that we're looking for gold-plated anything, but we need people who understand the materials and use them well, so that we don't bodge it and 10 years' time somebody has to come back and put it right. So finding good craftsmen is part of what an architect can do for you, or a surveyor, because they will be working with you to find contractors and craftspeople who understand their materials. When you employ an architect or a surveyor, it is possible they may be designing new things for you. Obviously, churches have to think about providing facilities like kitchens and toilets. And it's very important in that process that everybody thinks about how we're going to maintain them in the future, because there are issues about putting a roof somewhere that you then can't put a ladder to empty your gutter. And you need to address that before you hit the problem, because clearly one of the messages we need to get over is access is so important to good maintenance.
Ventilation is a very important part of a big building, and here the Victorians had this wonderful idea of putting vents in the wall with a pipe which goes up, and at the other end is another grille like this in the sill of the window, so that it gets air into the building.
So what happens if you don't have one of these?
Well, in the earlier churches that we've seen, in the windows you will find there's a little opening light, and so often they're sealed up and they're never opened again anymore now. But they should be opened so that you get the flow of air through the building.
Common sense, really.
It is, yes, but it just needs looking at. On a larger church like this, it's difficult to see everything from ground level, so where you have a tower and it's safe to go up the tower, that gives you a good opportunity to look down on everything. I've checked here, we have parapets around the tower, so it's quite safe.
Good.
Okay, so we go up and have a look, shall we?
Perfect.
And of course, one should never go up there alone. It's quite windy today, but there's still a great opportunity of looking at the various things that we can see that we just couldn't see from the ground level. There's that Lead Valley gutter there. You can see it's full of pine needles.
Oh, right. Yeah,
They've all blown in from, and they're going to block that shortly, and if it isn't cleaned out, then the rainwater will enter the church through the roof. And we can see where a vandal has recently climbed over the roof. I'm sure it is a vandal because the broken tiles are all the way up the roof there. So we can report that and urgently something can be done about it. And then also I've spotted down here that there's some green growth coming out of a buttress, which you probably can't again see from ground level. We can see the lead roof also from up here, And I can see a stain on it which is being caused by the leaking gutter directly above it.
So David, what's happened here?
Well, this is a classic example of a blocked rainwater pipe outside which wasn't unblocked, left for years, and all the water soaks through the wall and creates this mess. This is about 20 years ago.
Goodness.
And that's the result of it. Also, just an interesting point about this wall, it actually has a damp course. But when the church was built, unfortunately, the floor came just above the damp-proof course and caused moisture to go into the wall. And so all the bricks along the bottom of the wall were rotting away. And so the floor had to be cut away from the wall and a little ventilation strip put in, and then all new bricks placed along the bottom of the wall here.
Another expensive job?
That was very
I
expensive.
expect so.
But it was a constructional detail that went wrong. Sadly, over the last 40 years, when I've been working on churches, I've seen so much damage that could have been avoided. Some of it by inappropriate work, but much of it could have been by just a short bit of maintenance that would have solved the problem. It's cost thousands of pounds, and of course you have loss of historic fabric. There's tiles missing from roofs, splits in lead roofs which cause rot below. I've seen leaks in gutters which have dripped onto stonework and frozen and broken the stone. Far more expensive than repairing the gutter. I've seen rainwater pipes blocked up so long that they've taken the plaster off the inside of the wall of the building. I've seen ivy that has grown up so strong that the whole corner of a church had to be rebuilt. And ground levels which, if they had been kept low, would have not caused the dampness and also wouldn't have rotted the floors inside the buildings. Much of the things I'm talking about can be broken down into smaller elements, and to this end SPAB have created a wall calendar which volunteers can look at and see what needs to be done at different times of the year. And in August one can even not do anything but just sit in a deck chair. But it is a very useful tool.
Everything you have shown me and taught me this week has been of enormous value. When we've been going round, you've really opened my eyes to observe maybe small faults to deal with before they turn into big problems,
Yep.
which is wonderful. And also you've taught me the things that we can deal with and when to call in the professionals.
Yes.
And also to have a weekly look at the building, a yearly look for other things.
Yeah.
So all these things will now slot in. So I'm going home now to put all this into practice, I hope.
Good.
Thank you.
Planned maintenance is not difficult, and it does work. The Faith in Maintenance Handbook and Calendar, available from the website, give you all the information you need to draw up a schedule for your place of worship. It does, of course, involve a certain amount of work, but it's effective work with a clear purpose: to keep our places of worship strong, healthy, and intact for future generations. To stave off decay by daily care. We as people come and go, but our great and historic buildings live on if we care for them. Our care is our legacy.